The rain hammered downtown Seattle as James Carter ran toward the most important interview of his life, his only suit already soaked through. A red Mercedes sat crooked against the curb. A woman in a brilliant orange dress stepped out and immediately went down hard, her ankle twisting as her heel caught in a storm drain. Cars splashed past. Nobody stopped. James checked his watch 17 minutes until his interview. He looked at the woman struggling to stand in the downpour, closed his eyes knowing what this would cost him, then ran back. James Carter hadn't always been the kind of man who worked 3 part-time jobs to keep the lights on. 5 years ago, he'd been lead engineer at Boeing's experimental propulsion division, designing systems that would revolutionize commercial aviation. His corner office had overlooked Mount Rainier on clear days, which in Seattle meant maybe twice a month. But when that mountain appeared through the clouds, James would stop whatever he was doing and stare. It reminded him that some things were worth waiting for, worth working toward, even when they seemed impossibly distant. He'd met Sarah at a conference on sustainable aviation. She'd been presenting a paper on biofuels, stumbling over her words when the projector failed, her face flushing red as she tried to explain complex molecular structures without her carefully prepared slides. James had stood up from the 3rd row, walked to the front, and fixed the projector in 30 seconds. She'd looked at him with such gratitude that he'd forgotten how to walk back to his seat properly, bumping into 2 chairs and nearly knocking over someone's coffee. After her presentation, she'd found him at the coffee station. "My hero," she'd said, and he'd spilled sugar all over his shoes trying to play it cool. They were married 14 months later in her parents' backyard in Spokane. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit but still smelling faintly of lavender and age. James had written his own vows but forgotten them completely the moment he saw her walking toward him, settling instead for promising to love her, fix her projectors, and try not to spill things when she made him nervous. The crowd had laughed. Sarah had cried. Her father had clapped him on the shoulder afterward and said, "Take care of her," as if James could imagine doing anything else. Their house in Queen Anne was a 1,942nd craftsman that needed everything fixed. James spent weekends learning plumbing from YouTube videos, rewiring outlets with the power off, and Sarah standing nervously in the doorway with a flashlight. She painted every room a different color, bold choices that shouldn't have worked but did: forest green in the bedroom, deep purple in the bathroom, a shade of yellow in the kitchen that she insisted was butterscotch dream, but looked exactly like mustard to James. He loved it all because she loved it. When Sarah got pregnant, she documented everything in a journal that would later become James's most treasured possession. Every kick, every craving, every 3 a.m. moment when she'd wake him to put his hand on her belly and feel their son doing gymnastics. She'd written that James thought the baby would be an engineer like him, the way he was always moving, always building something in there. But she knew better. This little one was going to be an artist. She could feel it in the way he responded to music, to her voice, to the rain on the windows. Liam arrived during a thunderstorm, 2 weeks early and in a hurry. The birth was complicated. Sarah hemorrhaged badly enough that they rushed her into emergency surgery. James stood in the hallway, holding his minutes-old son, watching through a window as doctors worked to save his wife. A nurse found him there an hour later, still standing, still holding Liam, tears streaming down his face. "She's okay," the nurse said. "She's asking for you both." James had never run so fast in his life, even carrying a baby. Those first 2 years blurred together in James's memory like watercolors running in the rain. Sarah singing Liam to sleep with made-up songs about elephants who wore fancy hats. James building increasingly elaborate block towers for Liam to demolish with prehistoric glee. Sunday mornings at Pike Place Market, Liam in a carrier on James's chest, Sarah buying too many flowers because she couldn't choose just one bouquet. She'd been teaching kindergarten then, coming home covered in finger paint and glitter, stories about 5-year-olds who thought butterflies were just fancy moths, and that marriage meant someone who'd share their fruit snacks. The day Sarah died, it had also been raining. James remembered that detail with painful clarity, how she'd kissed him goodbye that morning. Tasting of coffee and cinnamon toast, complaining that her umbrella had broken and she'd have to make a run for it from the parking lot. He'd offered her his umbrella. She'd refused. saying he needed it more for his big presentation that afternoon. They'd had a playful argument about it, ending with her pushing him out the door. Laughing. "Go change the world, engineer man. I'll just change some 5-year-old's pants when they have an accident." Those were her last words to him. About pants. The call came at 2:47 p.m. James knew the exact time because he'd been checking his watch, waiting for his turn to present to the board. Sarah had collapsed during story time. By the time the ambulance arrived at the school, she was gone. Brain aneurysm. Instant. Painless. They assured him. As if that mattered. As if the fact that she didn't suffer somehow made it better that she was gone. That Liam would grow up without her. That James would wake up alone for the rest of his life in their mustard-yellow kitchen. The funeral was a blur. Sarah's parents took Liam for a week while James sat in his house, surrounded by her colors, her flowers dying in vases, her coffee cup still in the sink with lipstick on the rim. He'd tried to go back to work. But sitting in meetings about profit margins and production schedules felt like betrayal. His boss gave him extended leave. HR sent flowers. His team lead said to take all the time he needed. But what James needed was to be a father, fully and completely, without distractions or divided loyalty. The real reason for leaving Boeing was darker than grief. 3 months before Sarah's death, James had discovered critical safety flaws in the new 787 production line, specific stress points in the fuselage that could cause catastrophic failure under certain flight conditions. He'd run the simulations dozens of times, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. He reported it through proper channels, expecting immediate action. Instead, his supervisor, Thomas Marshall, buried the report. Production deadlines were more important than hypothetical risks, Marshall said. The planes were already sold. The contracts were signed. The stock price couldn't take the hit. James threatened to go to the FAA directly. That's when things got ugly. Suddenly, there were discrepancies in his expense reports from years ago. Small amounts, easily explained, but made to look like a pattern. There were questions about his mental state after Sarah's death, suggestions that grief had made him paranoid, unstable. Marshall offered him a choice. Resign quietly with a modest severance and keep his reputation, or be fired for embezzlement and blacklisted from the entire industry. With Liam to think about, James took the deal. 6 months later, he heard through former colleagues that the safety issues had been quietly fixed after a near disaster during a test flight. No one ever admitted James had been right. His resignation letter was 2 sentences. "I appreciate the opportunities Boeing has provided. My son needs me more." His boss tried to talk him out of it, offered part-time work, consulting, anything to keep his expertise. But James had made up his mind. The corner office was just a room. The 6-figure salary was just numbers. Liam was everything. The house sold quickly in Seattle's hot market. James found a 2-bedroom apartment in Northgate, close to a good elementary school. He drove Uber during school hours, the same streets he used to navigate in his BMW, now covered in a 10-year-old Camry that smelled perpetually of other people's coffee. He stocked shelves at Target overnight when Liam stayed with Sarah's parents. He did freelance technical writing at the kitchen table, translating engineering specifications into plain English, while Liam slept down the hall. Victoria Lane had been groomed for greatness since birth, though she'd never been asked if greatness was what she wanted. Her father, Marcus Lane, had started his defense contracting company in a garage in Tacoma with nothing but a laptop and a security clearance from his Navy days. By the time Victoria was 5, Lane Dynamics had its first Pentagon contract. By the time she was 10, they'd moved to a mansion in Medina with gates and guards and a view of Lake Washington that cost more than most people's entire homes. Marcus raised Victoria like he was training a successor, not raising a daughter. Dinner conversations were about market strategies and hostile takeovers. Bedtime stories were annual reports and acquisition proposals. When other girls were playing with dolls, Victoria was sitting in board meetings, silent but absorbing everything. She learned to read people's faces during negotiations, to spot weakness in a contract clause, to understand that power wasn't about money. It was about information and the will to use it. Her mother, Evelyn, had left when Victoria was 12. The divorce was quick and quiet. Sealed records and non-disclosure agreements. Victoria found out from a gossip blog that her mother had moved to Italy with her art dealer lover. Marcus's only comment was, "She lacked focus." Victoria learned not to lack focus. She learned to be perfect, controlled, necessary. She learned to be everything except happy. Wharton at 18 was Marcus's idea, but Victoria threw herself into it with desperate intensity. She graduated in 3 years, summa cum laude, with a thesis on emerging defense technologies that got attention from the Pentagon. Her professors said she was brilliant. Her classmates said she was terrifying. Both were true. She returned to Seattle with her MBA at 21, stepping directly into a vice president role at Lane Dynamics that everyone knew had been created specifically for her. The company became her entire world. She lived in a penthouse apartment 10 minutes from the office, though she often just slept on the couch in her executive suite. She knew every contract, every employee's name, every line item in every budget. When Marcus had his first heart attack at 62, Victoria took over seamlessly. When he returned 4 months later, he found she'd increased profits by 18% and secured 3 new government contracts. "Good," he said. Nothing more. Victoria had tried relationships in the clinical way she approached everything else. Men from appropriate backgrounds, with appropriate portfolios and appropriate ambitions. David, the investment banker who spoke 4 languages but couldn't hold a conversation about anything except money. Richard, the tech CEO who brought his laptop to bed and checked stock prices during intimate moments. Thomas, the senator's son who proposed on their 6th date with a ring worth more than most houses and a prenuptial agreement already drafted. She'd said yes to Thomas because it made sense, because Marcus approved, because it was what she was supposed to do. The engagement lasted 4 months. She found Thomas with her best friend, her only friend, really in his apartment, in the bed where Victoria had tried so hard to feel something beyond mild satisfaction and a vague sense of checking off a box marked intimacy. The betrayal should have hurt more than it did. Instead, Victoria felt relief. She didn't have to pretend anymore, at least not about that. Marcus's death came suddenly, unlike everything else in his calculated life. The FBI raid on Lane Dynamics headquarters was for charges Victoria hadn't seen coming 20 years of systematic bribery. Defense officials bought and sold like commodities. Marcus had built his empire on a foundation of corruption so deep, so systemic, that Victoria hadn't even known to look for it. He'd hidden it from her. Or maybe she'd hidden it from herself. All those signs she'd chosen not to see. When the agents burst into the building, Marcus had been in the lobby, coming back from lunch. The stress triggered a massive coronary. Victoria ran from her office, her heels clicking on marble, reaching him as he collapsed. She held him on that cold floor, his blood spreading across her white suit, while federal agents stood around them with their guns and their warrants and their careful expressions. Marcus grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises that lasted weeks. "Don't let them take it," he gasped. "Don't let them win." Those were his last words. Not "I love you," not "I'm sorry," just business, even dying. The aftermath nearly destroyed everything. The stock price plummeted 60% in 3 days. The board called emergency meeting after emergency meeting, half of them demanding Victoria's resignation. The media painted her as either complicit or incompetent, neither option leaving room for the truth, that she'd been so desperate for her father's approval that she'd made herself blind to his methods. Federal investigators combed through everything, looking for evidence of her involvement. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Victoria had been many things for her father, but never his confidant. He'd never trusted her that much. She saved the company through sheer force of will and strategic brutality. She fired every executive who'd known about the bribes. She brought in a new compliance team, giving them unprecedented power to investigate and report. She personally testified before Congress for 12 hours, answering every question with precision and ice-cold composure that made headlines. "The Ice Queen cometh," one paper wrote. She cut the article out and framed it, a reminder that survival sometimes meant becoming exactly what they said you were. But at night, in her glass penthouse that felt more like a terrarium for displaying a rare specimen than a home, Victoria fell apart. She'd have panic attacks in her bathroom, sitting on Italian marble that cost more than most annual salaries, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. She'd stand on her balcony, 30 floors up, and wonder what it would feel like to step off, to stop fighting for once. She never did it. Not because she wanted to live, but because dying felt like letting them win, and Marcus had taught her never to let anyone win. The morning she met James, she'd been driving to another emergency board meeting. Richard Donnelly, her largest individual shareholder and most vocal critic, had called it to discuss leadership concerns. Victoria knew he wanted her gone, replaced with someone he could control. She'd been strategizing her counterattack when the rain started, sudden and violent, the kind of Seattle storm that made driving feel like swimming. She'd pulled over to wait it out, too distracted by the conference call she was managing to raise the convertible's top, when she stepped out of the car and her heel caught. When she went down hard on wet concrete. Something inside her broke that had nothing to do with her ankle. She lay there for a moment, rain soaking through her designer dress, watching people walk past without stopping, and thought, "This is my life. I could disappear right here, and the only people who'd care would be the ones afraid of losing their jobs." The pain in her ankle was almost welcome, at least it was real, immediate, something she could point to and say, "This hurts." Then James appeared, running the wrong direction, and everything changed. The way he helped her up was so gentle, so careful, like she was something precious that might break more. His suit was cheap, probably off the rack from a decade ago, but he wore it with dignity. His hands were calloused. She could feel them through her dress as he supported her weight, but they were steady, sure. He didn't recognize her, she could tell. To him, she was just a woman who needed help. The simplicity of that, the purity of it, made her want to cry. He half carried her to the Starbucks, his arm around her waist, taking most of her weight without being asked. He smelled like rain and drugstore shampoo and something else. Something warm and safe that reminded her of her grandfather's workshop before he died, before Marcus turned her into this. James found her a chair, knelt in front of her without caring that his knees were getting soaked from the puddle on the floor, and examined her ankle with surprising expertise. "You've done this before," she said. "My son's very active," he replied, not looking up from her ankle. "I've gotten good at first aid. A son." Of course he had a family, a life, somewhere to be that wasn't here with her. "Your meeting," she said, remembering how he'd been running. "You're going to be late." He looked at his watch, and she saw him deflate, shoulders dropping like someone had cut his strings. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am." "Go," Victoria said. "I'm fine. Go." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw him make a decision that would cost him everything. "You're not fine," he said simply, "and they won't reschedule. It's their policy, so it doesn't matter anymore." He stayed until she insisted she could manage, until she'd called her driver, though she actually just pretended to call, too embarrassed to admit she'd been planning to drive herself home in this condition. When he left, she watched him walk back into the rain, his ruined suit clinging to him, his shoulders squared despite what he'd just lost. She didn't even know his name. Victoria sat in that Starbucks for an hour, her ankle throbbing, replaying the moment over and over. The way he'd turned back, the resignation in his voice when he'd said it didn't matter anymore. The careful way he'd touched her ankle, like he was trained to heal things, not hurt them. When was the last time someone had chosen her, not her money, not her company, not her connections, just her over something that mattered to them? By that evening, she'd had her security team pull the traffic camera footage. The facial recognition software found him in minutes. James Carter, 35, widowed, one son. The public records told a story that made her chest tight. Brilliant engineer at Boeing. Rising star. Multiple patents pending. Wife deceased, brain aneurysm. Age 31. Resignation from Boeing, immediately following her death. Current employment. Multiple part-time positions. Current residence. Northgate. Average rent for a 2-bedroom in that area, less than what Victoria spent on lunch most days. But it was the Boeing file that made her sit up straight. Her head of security had connections everywhere. It was part of what she paid him for. The real story wasn't in the official records. James had discovered critical safety flaws in the new 787 production line, the kind that could cause catastrophic failure under specific conditions. He'd reported it through proper channels. His supervisors had buried it, choosing production deadlines over passenger safety. When James threatened to go to the FAA, they destroyed him. Accusations of embezzlement, mental instability following his wife's death, a complete character assassination that ensured he'd never work in aerospace again. Victoria pulled up the security footage again, watched him turn back in the rain. This man had already sacrificed his career once for doing the right thing. He'd just done it again. For a stranger. She made a decision that went against every professional instinct Marcus had drilled into her. She was going to find James Carter and make this right. 3 days later, Victoria knocked on James's apartment door at 7 in the evening. The building was tired-looking. One of those 1,972nd complexes that had been renovated just enough to justify raising the rent, but not enough to actually improve anything. The hallway smelled like someone's dinner curry, maybe, or something with too much garlic. Children's voices echoed from somewhere above. This was so far from her world that Victoria almost turned back. But she knocked, and when James opened the door, the surprise on his face was worth the courage it had taken to come. He looked different in jeans and a t-shirt, younger, less formal. Behind him, she could see a small boy at a kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on something with crayons. "How did you?" James started. "I'm very good at finding people," Victoria said, which sounded more ominous than she'd intended. "May I come in?" The apartment was small, but meticulously clean. Toys organized in labeled bins. Children's artwork displayed on every wall, like a gallery. The furniture was old but well-maintained, everything arranged to maximize the limited space. It smelled like laundry detergent and apple juice, and something indefinable that she'd later recognize as the scent of a happy home. "Liam," James said to the boy, "this is Miss Lane. She's someone from Daddy's work." "You don't have work today," Liam pointed out with 5-year-old logic. "She's from potential work," James corrected, and Victoria saw him flush slightly. Liam studied her with his father's serious eyes. "Are you the lady with the hurt foot?" Victoria blinked. "How did you?" "Daddy said he helped a lady with a hurt foot, and that's why he was late to his meeting, and they said he couldn't have the job, but it was okay because helping people is more important than jobs." Liam delivered this in one breath, then added, "Do you want to see my dinosaur collection?" "Maybe later, buddy," James said quickly. "Why don't you finish your picture?" Liam returned to his coloring, but Victoria noticed he kept glancing at her with curious eyes. She pulled out the folder she'd prepared, set it on James's coffee table, a piece that had probably been new when Clinton was president. "I want to hire you," she said without preamble. "Technical consulting for Lane Dynamics. Reviewing our aerospace contracts, ensuring quality control. Preventing the kind of disasters Boeing tried to hide." James's face went carefully neutral. "You looked me up. I look everyone up. But yes, I know what happened at Boeing. I know you were right. I know what it cost you." She paused. "And I know you deserve better than stocking shelves at Target when you could be saving lives. I'm not in a position to take a traditional job. My son needs stability. Routine. I can't do 60-hour weeks or travel." "I'm not offering you a traditional job," Victoria interrupted. "Remote work, completely flexible hours. You work when Liam's at school or asleep. No office requirement. No travel unless you choose it. The salary's in the folder, along with benefits that include dependent coverage." James opened the folder, and she saw his eyes widen at the number. It was more than generous. It was life-changing. But his face remained troubled. "Why?" he asked. "You don't know me. One interaction in the rain doesn't—" "You turned back," Victoria said simply. "In the rain, late for something important. You turned back to help someone you didn't know. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The fact that you're also brilliant at what you do is just a bonus." She stood to leave, pulling out her business card. "Call me when you decide." At the door, she turned back. "The man who forced you out at Boeing? Thomas Marshall?" "When?" He works for my biggest competitor now. Just thought you should know that helping me means beating him." After she left, James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the contract while Liam colored beside him. The salary would mean he could stop driving Uber, stop stocking shelves, stop worrying about making rent every month. It would mean Liam could have the things other kids had: new clothes that fit properly, birthday parties that weren't just cake from a box, maybe even college savings someday. But more than that, it would mean doing work that mattered again, using his brain for something more than translating technical manuals. The handwritten note at the bottom of the contract decided him. Second, chances don't come often. Trust me. I know. V. James called Victoria 2 days later to accept the position. He started immediately, working from his laptop at the kitchen table while Liam was at school. The first contract he reviewed was for a new drone guidance system. He found 17 critical flaws in the first hour. Issues that could have caused navigation failures in combat situations. His report was thorough, meticulous, and so well written that Victoria forwarded it to the entire board with a note. "This is why we need people who care more about quality than quotas." The calls started as professional check-ins. Victoria would phone to discuss a contract detail, and somehow they'd end up talking for an hour about everything else. She learned that James sang Beatles songs in the shower. Badly, but with enthusiasm. He learned that she'd never learned to ride a bike, because Marcus thought it was a waste of time. She learned that he read Liam 3 stories every night, doing different voices for all the characters even though it made his throat hurt. He learned that she had panic attacks that she hid in bathroom stalls, breathing into paper bags from the sandwich shop downstairs. 6 weeks into their working relationship, Victoria showed up at the apartment on a Saturday morning with a box of pastries from the French bakery downtown. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, which was absurd since her neighborhood and his were separated by several tax brackets and a large body of water. Liam answered the door in dinosaur pajamas that had seen better days. "The foot lady," he announced with delight. "Dad, the foot lady brought food. Her name is Miss Lane." James called from the kitchen, where something was burning. "Victoria," she corrected, entering without invitation. The kitchen was a disaster: eggs stuck to a pan, smoke alarm threatening to go off. James looking harassed in an apron that said Dad's Kitchen in a child's handwriting. "I was trying to make omelets," he said helplessly. "Step aside," Victoria said, surprising herself. She hadn't cooked in years. There'd never been a reason to. But suddenly, she wanted to. She saved the eggs, though they became scrambled rather than an omelet. She found cheese in the fridge, some vegetables that were on the edge of acceptable, and made something that resembled actual food. They ate together at the small table. Liam chattering about school, about his best friend Marcus, who could burp the alphabet, about how his teacher Mrs. Chen had a baby in her tummy that was going to come out soon. Victoria found herself listening with genuine interest, asking questions that made Liam light up with excitement. James watched them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you have kids?" Liam asked suddenly, mouth full of egg. "No," Victoria said. "Why not?" "Liam," James warned. "It's okay," Victoria said. "Though it wasn't. Not really. I guess I've been too focused on work to have a family." Liam considered this with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could muster. "That's sad," he pronounced. "Everyone should have family. Like me and Dad. We're small, but we're good." Victoria's eyes burned with unexpected tears. "Yes," she said quietly. "You are." These visits became a pattern neither of them acknowledged. Victoria would appear with some excuse contracts to review. Educational toys for Liam she happened to see. Soup, when James mentioned feeling under the weather. She learned the rhythm of their life. Breakfast at 7, school drop-off at 8:15, lunch at noon sharp, because Liam got cranky if it was late. Dinner at 6, bath at 7, stories at 7:30, lights out by 8. She learned smaller things too. James couldn't sleep without checking on Liam at least twice. Liam was afraid of the vacuum cleaner but pretended he wasn't. They had pizza every Friday and watched movies on James's laptop because the television had broken months ago, and fixing it wasn't a priority. James still wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck, tucked under his shirt where no one could see. Liam had his mother's eyes, but his father's way of tilting his head when thinking hard about something. In return, though she didn't realize she was doing it, Victoria revealed herself. She told James about the panic attacks that started after Marcus died. How she'd sit in bathroom stalls breathing into paper bags, counting to 10 in different languages to calm herself. She told him about the engagement that ended when she found her fiancé with her best friend, how the betrayal had been less painful than the relief she'd felt at having an excuse to end it. She told him about standing on her balcony at 3 in the morning, wondering if anyone would notice if she just disappeared. They would, James said quietly when she admitted that. Liam and I would. 4 months after that first rainy morning, everything shifted. It was a Thursday evening, and Victoria had come over to review quarterly projections, but ended up helping Liam build a pillow fort that took over the entire living room. She was crawling out from under it, laughing at something Liam had said about dragons who wore business suits to trick people, when she looked up to find James watching her with an expression that made her forget how to breathe. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. Her hair was a mess, her designer blouse untucked, her makeup probably smeared. "You're different here," he said softly. "You're yourself." "Is that bad?" "No," James said, his voice rough with something she didn't want to name. "It's perfect." The moment stretched between them, fragile and terrifying and absolutely right. Then Liam announced he needed to pee right now, and it shattered. Victoria left soon after. But they both knew something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer employer and contractor, or even friends. They were something else, something neither had words for yet. The crisis that brought everything to a head came from Richard Donnelly. He'd been maneuvering against Victoria since Marcus died, but she'd always been one step ahead. This time, he'd found what he thought was a killing blow. The board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Victoria arrived to find the conference room full every board member, several major shareholders, and Donnelly himself, looking like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. He placed a folder on the table, containing James's Boeing file with fabricated embezzlement charges, photos of Victoria at James's apartment, and psychological evaluations taken out of context to suggest instability. "You've hired a disgraced engineer with mental problems and financial crimes," Donnelly announced. "He has access to classified contracts. This is a security breach, but more than that, you're personally involved with him. Fire him or resign. You have 24 hours. Victoria drove straight to James's apartment and told him everything. "I'll resign immediately," James said. "Distance yourself. Say I misrepresented my qualifications. Number. This isn't your fight. Donnelly's connected to Marshall at Boeing, isn't he? This is about me." They argued until midnight. The next morning, James sent his resignation despite Victoria's protests. He ignored her calls and texts, didn't answer when she came to the door. 24 hours after Donnelly's ultimatum, Victoria stood before the board. "Mr. Carter has resigned," she announced. "Smart choice," Donnelly said, already tasting victory. "I'm not finished." Victoria opened her laptop, connected it to the screen. The charges against James Carter were fabricated by Thomas Marshall, your brother-in-law, Mr. Donnelly. The same Thomas Marshall, who's now CEO of Apex Dynamics. Our biggest competitor. The same man who's been feeding you inside information about our contracts. She showed email after email, evidence of $17 million in bribes, corporate espionage, stock manipulation. The FBI will be very interested in these communications, unless you resign immediately and divest all shares. Donnelly capitulated in 5 minutes and fled. Victoria turned to the remaining board members. "James Carter is the most ethical man I've ever met. He sacrificed everything to prevent disasters. If we can't make room for people like that, what are we protecting?" She paused. "And yes, I'm in love with him. Anyone have a problem with that?" The board voted unanimously to vindicate James completely. Victoria drove to James's apartment through rush-hour traffic, When he opened the door, she said, "It's done. Donnelly's gone. The truth is out. You're vindicated." "Dad, why is Victoria crying?" Liam asked from behind James. "Because your dad is an idiot," Victoria said. "A beautiful, noble, self-sacrificing idiot who thought I'd let him fall on his sword again. If Victoria loves you, you should probably say it back," Liam advised his father. "I love you too," James said to Victoria. "I have since you made those terrible scrambled eggs." James pulled her inside, into their small apartment that smelled like dinner, cooking, and home. 6 months later, Victoria sold her penthouse and bought a house in Wallingford with a yard perfect for the treehouse Liam had always wanted. The night before moving in together, she found James staring at a photo of Sarah. "She would have liked you," James said. "She had this way of seeing through to who people really were." "Marry me," James said suddenly. "Not now, but someday. Marry me." The actual proposal came from Liam months later. He approached Victoria one Saturday with a ring pop and serious expression. "Will you marry me and Dad? He's too chicken to ask properly, and I really want you to be my mom officially." Behind him, James held a real ring. "Yes," Victoria said, to both proposals. They married the following spring in their backyard, rain falling soft as a blessing. They exchanged vows under a small awning built to recreate where James first helped Victoria. Liam served as ring-bearer and best man. In his impromptu speech, Liam said, "If Dad hadn't stopped in the rain, he would have gotten that job. But we wouldn't have Victoria. So I'm glad Dad missed his interview. Sometimes the best things happen when stuff goes wrong." As evening ended, Victoria stood watching the rain with James beside her, Liam asleep in his arms. "Thank you for stopping," she whispered. "Thank you for being worth stopping for," he replied. The rain continued, soft as promise. They were complete. They were family. They were home. The golden autumn light filtered softly through the playground trees, casting dancing shadows across the colorful equipment where children's laughter rang out like tiny bells. A successful CEO in her cream blazer stood watching her 8-year-old daughter on the swing, the child's blonde hair catching the sun as she moved silently through the air. A tall single father approached, his gentle voice greeting the quiet girl with a warm smile. The world seemed to pause as the child's lips parted. And for the first time in her life, she whispered, "Hello." Her mother froze completely, heart pounding, eyes widening in absolute disbelief. Victoria Sterling had built an empire from nothing. Her sharp mind and relentless drive transforming a small startup into a multi-million-dollar tech company. At 34, she commanded boardrooms with the same precision she once used to code through sleepless nights. Her appearance reflected this success. Perfectly platinum blonde hair always pulled into an immaculate bun, designer suits that whispered rather than shouted their price tags, and heels that clicked with authority on marble floors. Yet behind those calculating blue eyes lived a different story, one written in the language of a mother's desperate love for her silent child. Her daughter Emma was everything soft where Victoria was sharp. The girl possessed an ethereal quality, with hair like spun gold that fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, eyes the color of a summer sky, and skin that held the faintest blush of roses. She moved through the world like a ghost child, present but never quite touching it. Her silence, a wall that separated her from everyone except her mother. Teachers described her as brilliant but unreachable. A child who understood everything but gave nothing back in words. The man who had just changed their world stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his broad shoulders filling out a simple gray hoodie that had seen better days. Marcus Thompson carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had faced real danger and survived. His brown hair was cut short and practical, his jaw shadowed with stubble that suggested he prioritized his 6-year-old son's morning routine over his own grooming. His hands, large and calloused from years of physical work, moved with surprising gentleness when he spoke, painting pictures in the air that somehow made children trust him instantly. Marcus had traded his firefighter's helmet for a whistle 2 years ago, after a beam fell wrong and left him with a back that couldn't handle the physical demands anymore. Now he ran community sports programs, teaching kids to find their voices through movement and play. His son Jake was his opposite in every way, where Marcus was calm and measured. Jake bounced through life like a rubber ball, talking to everyone, befriending everything from dogs to doorposts. Their small American city provided the perfect backdrop for this encounter. Neither too large to be impersonal, nor too small to be stifling. The Central Park where they met stretched for several blocks. Its playground recently renovated with equipment in primary colors that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Victoria's journey with Emma had begun 8 years ago, in a delivery room where joy turned to concern when the baby didn't cry. The doctors assured her everything was fine physically, that some babies were simply quieter than others. But as months turned to years and Emma never babbled, never called out mama, never even cried with sound, the truth became undeniable. Test after test revealed nothing wrong with her vocal cords. Her hearing was perfect, her intelligence above average. The diagnosis came like a punch to the gut: selective mutism, likely caused by psychological trauma during birth, though no one could explain exactly what or how. The parade of specialists began when Emma turned 3. Speech therapists with their flashcards and exercises, child psychologists with their play therapy and art sessions, even alternative healers with their promises of breakthrough treatments. Victoria spent more on these appointments than most people spent on their mortgages, flying in experts from across the country, trying experimental programs that cost thousands per session. Each failure carved another piece from her heart, watching Emma's eyes dim a little more as another adult gave up on reaching her. School brought fresh wounds. Victoria still remembered the parent-teacher conference where Mrs. Patterson, meaning well, suggested Emma might be better suited for a special needs program. The other children had tried it first, drawn to Emma's pretty face and gentle manner. But kids have little patience for someone who won't play their games properly. They weren't cruel, exactly, just indifferent, which somehow hurt more. Emma ate lunch alone, played alone, existed in a bubble of silence that even the kindest teachers couldn't penetrate. Victoria's response was to build a fortress around her daughter. Private tutors replaced group classes when possible. Playdates were carefully orchestrated and usually abandoned when other mothers ran out of polite conversation about the shy little girl. Weekends meant just the two of them, Victoria reading aloud while Emma drew elaborate pictures, their communication a complex system of gestures, expressions, and the occasional written note. It worked, but it wasn't living. Many nights, Victoria would stand in Emma's doorway, watching her daughter sleep, wondering what dreams played behind those closed eyelids. Did she speak in her dreams? Did she laugh with sound? The silence of the house pressed against Victoria like a weight, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the whisper of wind against windows. She would give anything, absolutely anything, to hear her daughter's voice just once. That particular Thursday afternoon had started like any other. Victoria had cleared her schedule after 3:30, as she always did on Thursdays, to take Emma to the park. It was their routine, sacred and unchangeable. Emma would swing, while Victoria answered emails on her phone, occasionally looking up to wave or smile. The playground was usually busy enough that Emma could watch other children without the pressure of interaction. Marcus and Jake had arrived 10 minutes after them, the boy exploding onto the playground like a small tornado. Victoria noticed them immediately. It was hard not to notice Jake's enthusiastic greeting to every child in sight, including her silent Emma. "Hi, I'm Jake. Want to play astronauts? You can be the alien if you want, or the robot, or another astronaut." The boy's father followed, at a measured pace, clearly used to his son's exuberance. Victoria watched her daughter's reaction carefully. Usually, Emma would shrink back from such direct approach, her body language screaming discomfort. But something about Jake seemed different. Maybe it was that he didn't wait for an answer, just continued chattering while demonstrating his rocket ship technique on the slide. Emma's eyes followed him with what looked almost like curiosity. Then Marcus approached the bench where Victoria sat. "Mind if I sit? My kid has enough energy for 3 playgrounds." His voice was warm, with a slight rasp that suggested years of shouting orders through smoke. Victoria's first instinct was to politely decline, to maintain the barrier she always kept between Emma and strangers. But something in his manner, the way he didn't stare at Emma or ask immediately why she wasn't playing with the others, made her nod instead. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for several minutes, both watching their children. Jake had progressed to the monkey bars, providing running commentary on his adventure across the lava pit. Emma remained on her swing, but Victoria noticed she had stopped moving, her attention fixed on the animated boy. "Your daughter's very observant," Marcus said finally. "Not a question, but a statement. She's cataloging everything, isn't she? How Jake moves, how the other kids respond to him, the whole social dynamic." Victoria turned to look at him sharply. Most people called Emma shy, or special, or, worst of all, different. No one had ever called her observant with such respect. "Most people don't notice that," Victoria replied carefully, her fingers tightening on her phone. Marcus shrugged, his eyes still on the children. "I work with a lot of kids. Some learn by doing, some by watching. The watchers often understand more than we give them credit for." He paused, then added, "Jake's teaching method might be unconventional, but he's actually pretty good at including everyone, even if they don't respond the traditional way." As if to prove his point, Jake had circled back to Emma's swing. "Hey, silent astronaut. Watch this." He proceeded to demonstrate what he called a space jump from the swing, landing with exaggerated moonwalking steps. Emma's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but closer than Victoria had seen with any stranger. Jake seemed to take this as encouragement, continuing his space mission narrative while occasionally glancing at Emma as if she were his co-pilot. The pattern continued for the next 3 days. Marcus and Jake would arrive shortly after Victoria and Emma, the boy immediately launching into whatever adventure occupied his imagination that day. Pirates on Tuesday, deep-sea explorers on Wednesday, dinosaur hunters on Thursday. Each time, he included Emma in his narrative without demanding participation, assigning her roles that required no words. "You're the lookout," he'd announce, or, "You guard the treasure while I fight the shark." Marcus, meanwhile, had taken to bringing 2 cups of coffee from the cafe across the street, wordlessly offering one to Victoria. They would sit in companionable semi-silence, occasionally commenting on the children's play or the weather, nothing deep or probing. Victoria found herself looking forward to these afternoons more than she cared to admit, the simple acceptance in Marcus's presence a relief from the constant explanations and apologies she usually had to make for Emma's silence. On Friday, something shifted. Jake had organized a game with several other children, something involving pretend cooking and a restaurant. He'd assigned Emma the role of taste tester, which required only nodding or shaking her head, as the other children presented their sand pies and grass salads. Victoria watched her daughter actually step forward, joining the loose circle of children for the first time. Marcus moved closer to the action, not interfering but positioning himself where all the children could see him. When one boy complained that Emma wasn't saying if the food was good or bad, Marcus casually intervened. "Some of the best food critics write their reviews," he suggested, producing a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. "Emma, would you like to draw stars for how good each dish is?" The transformation was subtle but profound. Emma took the pencil with steady hands and began making careful star ratings for each offering. The other children, seeing this as a new element to their game, became even more engaged, trying to earn more stars. Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name. As the game evolved, the children decided they needed a ball to be their special ingredient. They began passing it in a circle, each child supposed to call out what magical power it added to their dish. When it reached Emma, the circle paused. Jake started to skip her, but Marcus stepped in with gentle authority. "Everyone gets a turn," he said simply, then looked at Emma with those steady brown eyes. "What does the magic ball add to the recipe?" The entire playground seemed to hold its breath. Emma looked at the ball in her hands, then at Marcus, then at her mother. Her lips moved slightly, forming shapes without sound. Marcus knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "I'm a little hard of hearing from all those fire truck sirens," he said with a conspiratorial wink. "Could you say it just a bit louder?" The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled to its limit. Victoria found herself leaning forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The other children waited with the natural patience kids sometimes surprise you with. Jake bounced slightly on his toes but didn't speak. Emma's fingers tightened on the ball. She looked directly at Marcus, took a breath that Victoria could see lift her small shoulders, and whispered, "Ball." The word was barely audible, like a leaf touching ground. But it exploded through Victoria, like thunder. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears instantly blurring her vision. 8 years of silence broken by one word, one impossibly beautiful word. The children, not understanding the magnitude of the moment, simply continued their game, Jake cheerfully announcing that ball was the perfect magical ingredient. Marcus stood slowly, his eyes finding Victoria's across the playground. He gave the smallest nod, acknowledging what had just happened, while somehow managing not to make it feel like a spectacle. He turned back to the children, keeping the game moving, letting Emma process this moment without pressure. But Victoria saw his hand shake slightly as he brushed it through his hair, saw the emotion he was controlling for all their sakes. The game continued for another 10 minutes, but Victoria absorbed none of it. Her entire being was focused on Emma, who had returned to her quiet observation but seemed somehow lighter, as if speaking that single word had released something trapped inside her. When the other children dispersed to different equipment, Emma walked to her mother with measured steps. Victoria knelt and opened her arms, and Emma stepped into them, allowing herself to be held in a way she usually resisted in public. They stayed like that for a long moment, Victoria's tears falling silently into her daughter's golden hair. When they finally separated, Marcus was standing nearby with Jake, who for once seemed to understand something important had happened, and was relatively still. "Thank you," Victoria managed, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't begin to contain. "I don't think you understand what you just—" 8 years. 8 years of silence. Marcus's expression softened, and she saw then that he did understand, perhaps more than she knew. "Every child has their own timeline," he said quietly. "Sometimes they just need the right key to unlock what's already there." Jake, unable to contain himself any longer, bounced forward. Emma talked. "That's so cool. Maybe tomorrow she can say spaceship. Or dinosaur. Oh." Or maybe Marcus placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. And Jake stopped mid-sentence, though his eyes still sparkled with excitement. "Would you like to know why it worked?" Marcus asked Victoria, his tone careful, professional. "I mean, if you're interested, I've worked with selective mutism before, though nothing quite this severe." Victoria nodded immediately, desperate to understand, to learn how to recreate this miracle. Marcus gestured to a nearby bench while the children returned to playing, Jake showing Emma his secret hiding spot under the slide. "Movement and speech are connected in the brain," he began, his hands illustrating unconsciously as he spoke. "When kids are engaged in physical play, especially repetitive activities like passing a ball, it can bypass some of the anxiety blocks that prevent speech. The game created a structure where speaking was just part of the pattern, not a performance." Victoria listened intently, her business mind automatically cataloging the information. "But the other therapists tried play therapy," she said, not challenging but seeking to understand. What was different? Marcus considered his words carefully. Most therapy still feels like therapy to kids. They know they're supposed to perform, to meet expectations. This was just play. Emma wasn't a patient who needed to be fixed. She was just a kid in a game who happened to have the ball. He paused, then added, "Plus, Jake doesn't treat anyone as different. To him, Emma's always been part of his adventures, whether she spoke or not. That acceptance might have made the difference." They talked for another hour, while the children played, Marcus sharing techniques he'd learned, working with traumatized children after fires, Victoria describing their long journey through the medical system. She found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, about the nights she wondered if she was failing Emma by pushing too hard or not hard enough, about the isolation of raising a child who couldn't tell you what hurt or what helped. Marcus listened with the same steady presence he'd shown with Emma, no judgment, no false promises that everything would be fine. When he mentioned he ran afternoon sessions at the community center, teaching kids confidence through sports and movement, Victoria heard herself asking if Emma could join before her logical mind could intervene. "Of course," Marcus said simply. "Tuesday and Thursday, 4 to 5. It's drop-in, no pressure. Parents can stay and watch or grab coffee next door." He smiled slightly. Jake would be thrilled. He's already planning tomorrow's adventure with his new silent astronaut partner. That weekend, Victoria found herself replaying every moment of Friday afternoon, analyzing it with the same intensity she brought to quarterly reports. Emma had returned to silence, but it felt different now, like a choice rather than a prison. Twice, Victoria caught her daughter mouthing words in the mirror, her lips carefully forming shapes without sound. Monday felt endless, Victoria's concentration shattered by hope she was afraid to fully embrace. She left 2 meetings early, delegated more than usual, and found herself watching the clock like a teenager waiting for summer break. When she picked Emma up from school, the teacher mentioned Emma had participated more in class, raising her hand to point at answers on the board instead of sitting passively. Tuesday's session at the community center was a revelation. The space was simple, just a gymnasium with basic equipment, but Marcus had transformed it into an obstacle course that looked like a giant game. 7 or 8 children were already there, Jake's voice rising above the others as he explained the mission to save stuffed animals from various dangers. Marcus greeted them warmly but without fanfare, simply pointing to where Emma could leave her backpack and join when ready. Victoria settled on the bleachers with 2 other parents, both of whom seemed relaxed and happy to chat or sit quietly. The pressure she usually felt in social situations with other parents was absent here. Emma stood at the edge of the group initially, but Jake immediately assigned her a crucial role. Emma's the eagle eye. She spots dangers we can't see. The other children accepted this without question, and soon Emma was pointing at different obstacles, guiding them through Marcus's course. When they needed to call out colors to move forward, Marcus modified the game so Emma could hold up colored cards instead. Halfway through the session, during a water break, one of the younger boys asked Emma directly what her favorite animal was. The familiar panic flashed across Emma's face, but before Victoria could intervene, Marcus smoothly redirected. How about we all draw our favorite animals and see if others can guess? He produced paper and markers as if he'd planned this all along, which, Victoria realized, he probably had. The week continued with small victories. Thursday's session involved rhythm exercises where kids copied patterns by clapping or stomping. Emma participated fully, her body learning to communicate in new ways. Marcus never pushed for speech but created countless opportunities where it could happen naturally. Jake remained her fierce champion, translating her gestures to others with surprising accuracy. Friday afternoon at the playground became a celebration of sorts. Jake had convinced several regular playground kids to play Emma's game, which involved elaborate pantomime and dramatic gestures. Watching her daughter actually laugh, silently but with her whole body, at Jake's exaggerated death scene in their pretend battle, Victoria felt something in her chest finally unclench after 8 years of constant tension. She's finding her way, Marcus said, appearing beside her with the usual coffee. Every session she's a little braver. Yesterday she actually touched my hand to get my attention instead of just waiting. That's huge. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. The gratitude she felt was too large for words, too complex for simple thanks. But success wasn't linear, as the next week proved painfully. Victoria's company was launching a major product, and despite her best intentions, she had to miss Tuesday's session for an emergency board meeting. She sent Emma with the nanny, promising to make Thursday without fail. But Thursday brought a system crash that threatened to derail everything. And again, Victoria had to send apologies through the nanny. Emma's regression was swift and heartbreaking. The light that had begun to shine in her eyes dimmed. She stopped participating in Marcus's sessions, returning to her role as silent observer. Jake tried everything to re-engage her, but Emma had retreated behind her walls, higher and thicker than before. Marcus's text on Friday was polite but pointed. Emma needs consistency. She needs to know you value her progress as much as your work. Victoria stared at the message, anger flaring initially at his presumption, then crumbling into shame because he was right. She'd done exactly what she swore she never would, chosen work over her daughter's breakthrough moment. She arrived at the playground that afternoon to find Marcus and Jake already there, but the easy warmth was gone from Marcus's eyes. Jake ran to Emma as always, but even he seemed subdued. Victoria approached Marcus, prepared to apologize, but he spoke first. "I get it," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're a single parent running a company, But Emma doesn't understand quarterly reports or board meetings. She understands that the week she started trusting enough to try, you disappeared. The words hit like physical blows because they were true. Victoria had built her entire life around providing for Emma, but she'd missed the moment when Emma needed presence more than provision. "You're right," Victoria said simply, surprising him. "I failed her. This week, when she needed stability most, I chose wrong." She looked at Emma, sitting alone on the swing, while Jake tried to interest her in his new game. "How do I fix this?" Marcus's expression softened slightly. "You show up, every time, no matter what. And when you absolutely can't, you explain it to her yourself, not through someone else. She needs to know she's your priority. Not in words, but in actions." He paused, then added, "There's a special session tomorrow. Saturday. Just Emma, Jake, and maybe one or two others. Can you both make it?" Victoria nodded immediately, already mentally canceling her Saturday conference call. "We'll be there." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you really think she'll speak again?" Marcus looked at Emma, then back at Victoria. "She spoke once. That means it's possible. But it has to be on her terms, when she feels safe enough. Our job is to create that safety." Saturday's session was unlike anything Victoria had expected. Marcus had set up what looked like a storytelling circle, with cushions and soft lighting that made the gymnasium feel intimate rather than institutional. Only Jake and one other child, a quiet girl named Amy, were there. Marcus explained they would be creating a story together, each person adding one part, using whatever communication felt comfortable. Jake began enthusiastically, setting up an elaborate tale about underwater explorers. Amy added details about magical sea creatures. When it came to Emma's turn, Marcus offered her multiple options. She could draw, use gestures, or whisper to Jake, who could speak for her. Emma chose to draw, creating a detailed octopus that the others incorporated into the adventure. The story continued for an hour, weaving back and forth between the children. Victoria watched her daughter slowly relax, her drawings becoming more animated, her body language opening. When Marcus suggested they act out parts of the story, Emma actually stood up, moving her arms like octopus tentacles while Jake narrated dramatically. Then, during a particularly exciting part where they were escaping from a sea monster, Jake dropped the foam ball they were using as a pearl. It rolled to Emma's feet. Without hesitation, she picked it up and held it out to him. "Here," she said clearly, the word cutting through the space, like sunlight through clouds. Jake froze for a second, then beamed. "Thanks, Emma." He continued the game as if nothing monumental had happened, but Victoria saw Marcus's eyes widen, saw Amy's delighted smile. Emma seemed surprised by her own voice, but not scared. She had chosen to speak, not been forced or tricked into it. The session ended with the children drawing pictures of their adventure. Emma drew herself as part of the group, not separate or watching, but participating. When it was time to leave, she walked to Marcus and tugged on his sleeve. He knelt down, and she whispered something Victoria couldn't hear. Marcus nodded seriously, then said, "I'll tell him you said goodbye. He'll be happy to hear it." In the car, Victoria asked carefully, "What did you tell Marcus?" Emma was quiet for so long Victoria thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice rusty from disuse but determined, she said, "Tell Jake, thank you." 3 words. 3 impossible, beautiful words. Victoria pulled into a parking lot and turned to look at her daughter fully. "Emma, I'm so proud of you, and I'm sorry I wasn't there this week when you needed me." Emma looked at her with those wise blue eyes, then reached out and patted her mother's hand, a gesture of forgiveness that made Victoria's eyes burn with tears. The next month brought steady progress. Emma began speaking in whispers to Jake regularly, sometimes to Marcus, occasionally to Amy. She still couldn't manage school or strangers, but within the safe circle of the community center and playground, her voice grew stronger. Victoria rearranged her entire schedule, making Tuesday and Thursday afternoons sacred, turning down meetings worth millions to sit on bleachers and watch her daughter bloom. Marcus and Victoria fell into a rhythm too, coffee conversations becoming dinner plans, always with the kids, but increasingly feeling like something more. He shared his story gradually. The wife who'd left when Jake was 2, unable to handle the uncertainty of a firefighter's life. The injury that ended his career but led him to discover his gift for working with traumatized children. Victoria told him about Emma's father. A brief relationship that ended when he learned about the pregnancy. His absence both a wound and a relief. The crisis came on a Wednesday morning in November. Victoria received a call from school that Emma had locked herself in the bathroom after a group presentation where the teacher had insisted she at least try to speak. By the time Victoria arrived, Emma was in full panic, hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face. Victoria's first instinct was to take Emma home, to protect her from the world that demanded too much. But something made her call Marcus instead. He answered immediately, heard the situation, and said simply, "Bring her to the park. Jake and I will meet you there." It was a risk, taking a traumatized child to a public space, but Victoria trusted him. They arrived to find the playground empty except for Marcus and Jake, who was setting up what looked like their very first game, the restaurant with the magic ball. Without any preamble, Jake announced, "We need our taste tester, the galaxy's pickiest food critic." Emma was still shaking, still tear-stained. But Jake's matter-of-fact inclusion reached her. She took her familiar position in the game, and slowly, gradually, her breathing steadied. When the ball came to her, she held it for a long moment. Then, looking directly at her mother, she said in a clear voice, "I want to play again." The sentence hung in the air like a declaration of independence. Not just wanting to play, but wanting to try again. To not let the morning's trauma define her. Victoria felt her knees actually buckle, and Marcus's steadying hand on her elbow was the only thing that kept her upright. They played for an hour, Emma speaking several times within the safety of the game. When it was time for lunch, Jake suggested pizza, and to Victoria's amazement, Emma nodded and said, "Cheese, please." To Marcus, when he asked what kind, 2 words to almost strangers in a public setting. The impossible becoming possible. Over pizza, while the kids drew on their placemats, Marcus said quietly, "She's going to be okay. It won't always be linear, but she's finding her voice." The panic this morning wasn't a setback. It was her fighting against the silence instead of accepting it. Victoria reached across the table and took his hand, not caring who saw. "We couldn't have done this without you. Either of you." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "You would have found another way, but I'm glad it was our way." Jake looked up from his drawing, observed their joined hands, and announced, "Good. Emma needs a dad who understands quiet. And I need a mom who has good snacks." Emma's mom always has those fancy crackers. The adults froze, but Emma looked at Jake, then at their parents' hands, and smiled. Not a half smile or a hidden smile, but a full, radiant expression that transformed her face. "Family," she said. The word careful, but certain. Christmas came with a special kind of magic. Emma could now speak in full sentences to her inner circle, though she still went silent around strangers. The school had finally agreed to an individualized education plan that didn't require verbal participation. Victoria had restructured her company's leadership to allow for more flexibility, and Marcus had started joining them for Sunday dinners, bringing Jake and a comfortable ease that made their unconventional family feel inevitable. The breakthrough everyone had been waiting for came in February, during Jake's 7th birthday party. Emma had helped plan it for weeks, and when it came time to sing happy birthday, her voice joined the chorus. Not loud, not confident, but present. Every parent there understood they were witnessing something special, and not one of them made it awkward by commenting. Later, as Jake opened presents, he saved Emma's for last. She had drawn him an elaborate comic book of all their adventures, each page detailing a different game they'd played. When Jake hugged her, she whispered something in his ear that made him beam. "Emma says, next adventure, she's the narrator," he announced proudly. Spring arrived with possibilities. Marcus and Victoria's relationship had evolved into something neither had expected but both treasured. They were cautious, mindful of their children, but the connection was undeniable. Emma had started speaking to her teachers occasionally, single words but voluntary. Jake had become her fierce protector at school, matter-of-factly explaining to anyone who would listen that Emma talks when she's ready, and if you're nice, she might be ready sooner. The moment that changed everything came on an ordinary Thursday in May. They were at the playground, their usual spot. When Emma climbed to the top of the jungle gym, Victoria watched, always slightly anxious when Emma went high. Marcus stood nearby, ready but not hovering. Jake was digging in the sandbox, building what he claimed was a dinosaur hospital. Emma looked down at all of them, her family and everything but Law, and called out in a voice clear as a bell, "Look at me. I'm flying." The words carried across the playground, causing other parents to look up. Victoria's hand flew to her heart. Marcus's face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen. Jake abandoned his dinosaurs to cheer. But Emma wasn't done. As she climbed down, she went to Marcus, tugged on his shirt until he knelt, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Jake's dad. Will you be my dad too?" The playground seemed to stop breathing. Marcus looked at Victoria, who was crying too hard to speak but nodding emphatically. He turned back to Emma and said softly, "I would be honored to be your dad." Jake, never one to be left out of a moment, ran over and added, "And Emma's mom can be my mom. We're getting a whole family." He looked at Emma seriously. "But you have to talk at our wedding. Deal?" Emma considered this, then nodded. "Deal." 6 months later, on a perfect October afternoon, they stood in the same park where it all began. Victoria wore a simple cream dress that moved in the breeze, her hair down for once. Marcus had actually worn a suit, though Jake had already managed to get grass stains on his matching pants. Emma stood between them in a yellow dress she'd chosen herself, holding the rings. When the officiant asked if anyone had any words to share, Emma stepped forward. The small gathering of family and close friends held their breath. She looked at Marcus, then at her mother, then at Jake, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "My mom was sad because I couldn't talk," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "Marcus and Jake showed us that love doesn't always need words. But now that I have words, I want to say them." She turned to Marcus. "Thank you for waiting until I was ready. Thank you for making Mom smile again. Thank you for being my dad, even before I could ask." She turned to Jake. "Thank you for being the best brother and never making me feel broken." Finally, she faced her mother. "Thank you for never giving up, even when it was hard. I always heard you, even when I couldn't answer." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. Jake, unable to contain himself, shouted, "Group hug," and they collapsed together, a laughing, crying tangle of limbs and love. Emma's laughter, with sound, rang out like the sweetest music Victoria had ever heard. As they stood to exchange vows, Victoria looked at this man who had changed their lives simply by seeing her daughter not as a problem to be fixed, but as a person to be understood. Marcus caught her eye and winked, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was, that sometimes the best families are the ones that find each other in unexpected places. The ceremony concluded with Jake and Emma releasing butterflies they'd raised themselves. Watching them scatter into the sky, Emma called out, "Fly high, butterflies," her voice confident and clear. As the insects disappeared into the blue, she slipped her hand into Marcus's and her other into her mother's, with Jake holding onto Marcus's other side. Standing there in the golden afternoon light, in the park where a silent girl had found her voice and a broken family had become whole, Victoria realized that some victories couldn't be measured in profit margins or corporate successes. Some victories were measured in words finally spoken, in trust finally given, in love finally received. Emma looked up at her new complete family and said simply, "Home." And it was.